What's up, everyone? So originally this was going to be in the same video as the last video, but once I laid all the parts out here, I realized that was going to make that video way too long, and it kind of went against our theme of keeping all of this stuff segmented. So, as you can see, today we are going to be assembling all of the servos, the accumulator, the second gear, anchor, strut, and lever, the apply piston, apply band, and the low reverse piston and band. So, first thing we can do, and once again, this is a no orders of operation on any of this stuff. You could do this in any combination that you want. I just like to work front to rear, kind of my theme. So, on a 600 horsepower build, you are going to get, or an entry level 2.0, you are going to get this billet servo setup. This is for your front servo. And you can see here it's missing the pin, so you'll need to reuse the pin from your OEM servo. Now, if you have an entry-level build, you'll be using the whole stock servo and pin, so technically you don't have to do anything here unless you want to take this apart and clean it, which I always recommend. Now, there is a little snap ring in here that is going to require this style snap ring pliers, and we need to actually compress this to get it apart. So we will flip this around, and then now we will be ready to get this out of there. Always watch your eyes on stuff like this. And then we'll pull our pin out, and in our application here we can go ahead and throw the rest of this in the garbage. Now, you'll see there's a spring and a retainer. You want to save the retainer, and the spring is optional. You can run the spring again if you want. I personally do not like to. There is a aluminum spacer that comes with this piston, and regardless of what I'm doing, I like to ditch this spring and run that aluminum spacer. And then at the same time, you're going to want to ditch this here O-ring and replace it with the new one. So like always, before we go reassembling any of this, we're going to make sure that we get this nice and cleaned up. And then once more, I'll take my red scuff pad and I'll run it around the pin here and make this a nice new sealing surface for our front servo cover, because now it will have an O-ring. So now that I've got the pin nice and cleaned up, ready for a new sealing surface, I'm going to put my O-ring on. Just make sure that it's in the groove nicely. I'm going to take the aluminum spacer and put it down in the servo there, and then wet the O-ring with some oil. And then now I'm ready to put these two together. So you just nicely work it down in there. This one's not very hard. You know, you just go nice and slow, and it goes together just like that. Now I'm going to take my little retainer, put it down in there, take my snap ring again, squeeze it together to get it down in there, and make sure it's in all the way. And when it's in all the way, it should look like that. So now this piston, I'm going to soak in some oil, and then it's ready to put in the servo bore. Once again, you already know I'm anal, and I'm going to reclock the cuffs of the seals here, just so that way they're offset from each other. Alright, now we're ready to put this in. So when you put this in, nothing special, just be careful, work it in nice and slow, and go in just like that. I kind of move it up and down just to make sure that it feels good, and now we're done with that. So the next thing you need to do is you need to go to your valve body box, open that up, take the valve body bag, open it up, and this will be zip tied to your valve body. This gold spring, sometimes it's more of a silver color. Cut that off, and this is going to be your front servo spring. Now, for a ranging pressure valve body of any 47 or 48, 600 horsepower and less setup, you're going to run just this gold spring. In some applications, you would run both springs, like if you're building a 47 RH and it's a constant pressure valve body, then I'll actually run both of these. And then if you're doing a full manual valve body, I'll also run both of these too, because then that allows us to tune in the 2-3 shift with the TV lever. But we'll get to that when we get to the valve body section. So you're going to take your single gold spring and you're going to put it in here. And usually I have this setting on its back, so it's easier for this to stay in place. But so that way you guys can see I've got it like this. So now we need to open up our Sonex front servo cover. And there's an O-ring in here that you want to make sure you don't lose. That little guy right there. And you already know I'll dip him in some fluid. Got a little bit of fluid here on the table that's nice and convenient. And then there's a little groove inside here, and that's where you'll put him. This is the seal for the front servo pin. Should go in like that. Shouldn't need to use any tools or anything to risk cutting it. And then now we need to go to the seal kit again. And we need to get one cast iron sealing ring that looks like this. That is going to go on the outside of this. Now the way I like to do it is I'll take my finger and I'll start one side into the groove like that. And then I'll hold the other side open like this. And then it'll fall in. You got to be careful because if you spread them too much, you can break these. And then usually I have some ATF on my hands like I do right now. And I'll run around it just so that way it's going in the bore dry. So now we're ready to install the front servo cover. So you just line it up with the pin like so. And I'll probably have to turn this up so I can push down on it. But you'll use this retaining ring. As you can see, the front one is larger than the rear one. So that's self-explanatory. And you'll put the retaining ring in there. And then this is where I use Mr. T25 torque screwdriver. And I'll basically push down on this with my thumb, push down on this on the other side. Sometimes you gotta tap it like that to get the cast ring started. And then I'll push it down, hold down with my thumb, and then I'll run around it and put the snap ring in. So I'll go ahead and do that right now. So once you've got it in, you want to check and make sure that it's fully in the snap ring groove. If it's over here closer to the edge of the machine part of the cover, you don't have it all the way in, take your screwdriver and tap on it a little bit, or compress it with your thumbs and make sure it goes all the way in. Now there is a tool for this if you want to buy it. I have pretty strong thumbs, so it's not a big deal for me. When you get into putting that spring with the stock spring in it, it does get pretty heavy. So it's one of those deals where if you're a little patient, you don't need to spend the money on the tool, but if you want to, you certainly can. So now, before I move on to the accumulator, I like to go ahead and finish the second gear band because I'm just a front to back working kind of guy. So we will need this pin, and we will need our 3.8 lever kit. So you'll pull this out, and then the apply lever is the first thing that we're going to install. So if you remember from disassembly, this pin came out the front through that 1/4 inch plug. It's going to go back in the same way. This pin is going to ride, this lever is going to ride on the pin like so. And you're going to push this in until it pushes through. Now once you've got that through, you can do this one or two ways. You can either go ahead and put this 1/4 inch MPT 1/4 inch extension back in, so that way you don't have to worry about it. That's how I normally do it. Or you can move on to the second gear band. Doesn't matter either way. But we're going to go ahead and put this back in. Now I like to put a little bit of right stuff around this, and this is where you're going to get into me seeing me use right stuff. I'm a big fan of right stuff. If you want to win me over at the racetrack, don't bring me beer, bring me right stuff. So once I have a little coating of that on there, then we're ready to screw that back in. And then I just run this in until it's good and hand tight. You don't need to wail on it. Just make sure that it's, tightens up snug by hand with a little 1/4 inch ratchet and call it good. That right stuff will set up and that thing will never ever leak. Okay, so now we're all done with that. Now we can move to putting the apply strap and the apply anchor on. So to do that, what I'll do, and let me see if I can spin this around so I can show you. You can see we have the second gear adjuster screw here. And so what I like to do is, once again, I like to put just a little bit of right stuff on this, just to make sure that you never have a problem with this deal leaking. And then I'll take my finger and I'll run around the adjustment screw like so. Now this is something you don't necessarily have to do, but I have ran into a few units that leaked from this, and this solves that from happening, so I would recommend doing it. Now I'm going to spin this back around, but basically I'm going to run this in until it's just barely protruding from the case, so I'm going to spin it around so I can show you that. Okay, you can see here that the ball on the end of the adjustment screw is just barely sticking out. So now I will take my strap, and you can see that the strap is angled on one side and flat on the other. The flat should always face up. If you put it this way, it could come into contact with the valve body when the second gear band applies. So we're going to put that facing up, and you can see how it's got these little locking tabs here. The band has a tab and the apply lever has a tab. So you make sure that those are locked in together. And then now we can put our anchor in. Same deal with the anchor. It has a little tab, and then it goes into the adjustment screw like that. So now I will run this down. And what I will actually do is I will actually tighten this all the way up, good and tight. I'll make it nice and snug, and then I'll move on to the rest of this, and then we'll go back and adjust this last. And the reason I do that is I'm pre-stretching the band. If you put a lot of pressure on this band and you get it to pre-stretch, it doesn't move nearly as much within the first 500 miles break-in period. And so it just makes it a little bit easier for the customer, or in your case, for you guys, so that when you get to the 500 mile, your second gear band isn't way out of adjustment before you get there. So now the next thing we're going to do is install the accumulator. This is super straightforward. It's going to come out of the box looking just like this. All we need to do is wet it down with some transmission fluid and install it right here. So I'll put this thing in, and I'll get it close like that by hand, and then I'll take my hammer and I'll take the butt of the hammer and I'll just lightly tap on it until it goes all the way down like that, and that is done. Now usually I'll go ahead and take my accumulator spring and just set it on there. Make sure obviously it's cleaned, and you know, you'll have to maintain it because we'll be flipping this thing up and around, and so it might get away from you, but I like to set it right there. That way there's no chance of you forgetting it. So now the next thing that we're going to do, which is going to be almost the last thing, is we are going to install the rear servo. But before we get to building the rear servo, you're going to want to take this big pin with the little tapered part of the pin here, or machined down part I should say, of the pin, and you're going to install it into the back of the case like so. And if you look back here, you'll see where there's a big old hole by the overdrive apply piston support, and that is because that goes there. And so you want to lift the band up a little bit like that, slide it in, and then push your band down, and then that'll keep that pin held in. But you want to make sure that while we're putting this together, that pin doesn't fall out on you. So now the next thing that we need to do is we need to put our reverse servo together, and let me show you how to do that. So once you got your servo out of the box there, the new billet one, and you've got everything unpacked, the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to take your stock servo apart. So to do that, we'll have to spread this little tiny baby E-clip apart. Now this kind of sucks because you got to have a really small set of snap ring pliers that look like this to be able to get into that little thing. And it's a pretty heavy spring, so you got to put quite a bit of pressure down on it. So once I've got that off, now I can pull this apart. And the only thing we're going to use out of this is this spring. So all this stuff can go in the garbage. Now, if you bought a kit with a full manual valve body, you actually can skip that step that we just did there because you won't be using this spring. It'll come with a little spacer that goes in here and actually a new snap ring, so you can put it together really nice and easily. But since this is a full functioning, we don't get that luxury. So, what we need to do is we need to assemble this like so. So this spring is going to go on here, this is going to go in the servo, and then we have to push down and reinstall our lovely, fun to use little baby snap ring. It's a little bit easier to install than it is to take apart, but it still sucks. Be prepared to spend a little time fighting with this guy. Alright, so once you got that installed, you fought with it and you got it in there, now we're ready to, one, make sure that it's clean again, and then start putting our Teflon seals on. So these Teflon seals, sometimes you've got to kind of bend them around a little bit to make them conform properly, just to make it easier to get it in the bore. Like I've done here, except for this thing's making me chase it. Okay. So that seal, that's good enough confirmation there. It'll conform when it goes in. And then you already know that I'm spinning these things 180 degrees of each other. And then we're going to take our lip seal, and just like all the other seals, we're going to install it like this. So that way, the way that the fluid is coming in, it is trapping it. So now this is ready to install in the bore, and all we need to do is soak this down and put it in. So when you're putting this one in the bore, just go real slow, kind of work it back and forth. This one's really tight. You don't want to make sure you don't mess up any of those sealing rings, and you want to get past the snap ring groove, and now it's in. The purpose of this billet rear servo is especially needed on a full manual valve body where you're constantly using the reverse servo every time you put it in first gear. The stock servos, they're thinner and they can actually twist in the bore and get hung up. It's honestly not nearly as important on a full functioning valve body because you're only using this low band when you put it in reverse. When you put it in drive, it's not using the low band. But it's a good idea. It's cheap insurance policy, so I put them in everything, and they're going to come in all of your guys' kits. So now, the next thing we need to do is we need to install the rear servo spring, and the retainer, and the snap ring. Once again, because this is a full functioning valve body, we're going to be using the stock retainer and the stock spring. If this was a full manual, it would come with a much heavier spring and a billet retainer that you would use to install. So this is really straightforward. The spring goes in, it sets in the servo nicely. This one's much easier to put together because it has much less spring pressure. The tapered part of this, the little shoulder on it, goes down on the spring like that. And then you take your snap ring and same deal as before. Put it in there, start the snap ring like that. Get Mr. T25 back out and put this thing in. I usually like to run around the snap ring like this. That seems to be the easiest way to do it. Make sure that I don't have any contamination on there. Boom. Our rear servo is done. So now the next thing we need to do is put the pin and the lever in and then do our final adjustments on both of these bands. So before you put the pin in, you're going to see that it had two brown O-rings on here before. You want to peel those off, go into your seal kit, and get the two new brown O-rings and roll them back on. These are a little bit more forgiving. You don't have to be so careful with these. Just make sure you don't cut them or anything crazy. And then I'll dry them up, and I like to put a little bit of my favorite substance on it, a little Right Stuff, and smear it around. And this is basically just to ensure that you don't have a leak, because if this pin was to leak, you'd have to pull the overdrive section off to be able to fix it, and that would suck. So now I'll start the pin in here like so, and I will take my apply lever, and this pin side goes down into the bore of the servo. Now we can just slide the pin in here, And sometimes you'll need to go ahead and back the adjuster nut off, which is a 9/16 nut. And this will allow you to be able to put the pin in much easier. And sometimes these things are very tight. Back the adjuster screw off a little bit, and then it'll go in much easier. And then push it all the way in. Sometimes with the new seals, it's a little tougher than normal, and you got to push on it a little bit. And then once it's in, I usually just wipe the excess right stuff off. And now our pin is in, our low reverse servo is all done, and so now we need to do our final band adjustments. So what you're going to need for this is you're going to need to bust out your inch-pound torque wrench again, and you're going to need a 1/4 inch socket this time, and we're going to run this down to 72 inch-pounds to start with. And once again, make sure before you torque this that your pin hasn't fallen out. Alright, so we're 72 inch-pounds in. And now, I'll take my 1/4 inch socket off, and I will use a regular 1/4 inch ratchet. And now we need to back this off 3 1/4 turns. So to do that, we need to put the socket back on, and then I like to start, somewhere square so I can have a good reference. So I'll put it, square of the transmission case, and then we'll go 1, that's 1 full turn, that's 2 full turns, and then we'll go 3 full turns, and then a 1/4 turn is going to be directly right here. So that's 3 1/4 turns. Now we need to hold that in place, and we need to spin the lock nut down, and then we need to lock down this jam nut while we hold the ratchet so it doesn't move. And you don't have to go crazy with this jam nut, you just need to lock it down decently tight, and then boom, rear band is properly adjusted. When the rear band's properly adjusted, you should be able to take your thumb and push on the center lining here and hear it make noise. That means that there's enough play in the band there to keep it lubricated nicely, and then you should be able to just pull up on this a little bit and not have a bunch of excess play. Now, if you are putting together a full manual setup, I actually like to go 3 1/2 turns on a full manual, just so it has a better 1-2 shift. But on a full functioning, 3 1/4 is what we're shooting for. So now, we can't forget to loosen up our second gear band. If we don't, this thing will mechanically be locked in second gear. So, we're going to back off our adjuster screw. And then we're going to do the same 72 inch-pounds in on this as we did before. Alright, so now we've got this to 72 inch-pounds. So I'm going to spin this around so I can show you guys how to do this a little easier. So now once we've got it down to 72 inch-pounds, and you want to make sure that the nut isn't bottomed out and giving you a false reading of 72 inch-pounds, we're going to do the same thing that we just did before with the low band, except this time we're only going to back it out 2 turns. So once again, I like to get it square in a plane with something, and then we'll go 1 full turn, 2 full turn. Now this is a T40 Torx that you'll need, and a 3/4 inch wrench. So once I've got it where I want it, I'll hold the ratchet, and then I will tighten it up with the 3/4 inch wrench, making sure that the adjuster screw doesn't move. Now once we've got that locked down, don't have to go super crazy tight with it, just make sure it's good and snug, and then we can spin this back around, and now we can just kind of pick up on our pin and see what we've got. With everything being adjusted correctly, you should have no more than a 1/4 inch of gap to 5/16 of an inch gap maximum, and this one feels like it's right at a 1/4, and we know that it's good to go. Now, the factory spec on this is 2 1/4 turns. I like to set them up at 2 turns because it seems to be a more positive 2-3 shift, but if you set it up like this and maybe your clutch clearance isn't 100% dead perfect, you might experience a little bit of a 2-3 bind. If you do, then you can back this off a 1/4 turn. But I wouldn't go and set that final measurement, unless it's, you know, a pretty decent bind, until after you've done your initial 500-mile break-in, because after 500 miles, you're definitely going to need to readjust the second gear band, and then you could just do it at that time. So now, there's only one thing that we're going to do before this case is ready for the overdrive section to be put on. We're going to flip it up in the air like this, spin it around, and we're going to install our shift selector seal, so that way we do not forget. So you're going to go back over to your little seal kit, and you're going to find the selector seal. It's going to be a bronze color at the top, and it's going to look like this, and it's going to be pretty obvious because it's the only thing that goes in this area that's going to fit. Now, once again, I like to put just the smallest amount of right stuff on the outside of this. I mean, just a little bit. Put a little bit on it like that, and then I'll run this around with my fingers. I'll make sure I've got the right stuff all the way around, and then I try to make sure that there's nothing down in the seal area, and then ready to set this in there. The reason I do this is so that way you never have to worry about a leak here, because I have ran across quite a few of these that you can install them perfectly right, and they'll get loose over time if they get hot, and then if they loosen up they can move, and if they move they start leaking, and that's a pain to deal with in the truck. So you're better off to just put a little bit of right stuff on it. So now I'll hold one side with my finger, and I'll just tap on this a little bit, try to get it good and square. And then I'll get it close like that with the hammer, and then I'll take a 1/4 inch extension and nicely go around the outer edge. You want to be careful not to tear up the sealing ring that rides on the selector shaft when you do this, but you do need to get it sunk all the way down in here for you to not have any problems. And then once it's all the way in, you'll know because it'll be below the lip, and then I just take my finger and run around the outside of the lip, and that really seals that right stuff down in there, and now you'll never ever have to worry about that thing leaking around the outside. Alright, so we've got our main case all outfitted, ready to go. So that's going to conclude this video, and in the next video we're going to install the overdrive apply piston and get the overdrive section on, and then the case will be completely ready to go for the valve body. So stick around for that.